and welcome everyone. In our last video, we have discussed about the Vienna game. And as I have promised you that in this video, I will be telling you the tricks and traps in the Vienna gambit. So without wasting time, let's get started. As we know, the Vienna starts with e4, e5 and we play a knight to c3. Instead of doing the common knight f3 or bishop c4, we go for knight c3. Here the most common response from black is to play the knight to f6. And the idea behind Vienna was to push your pawn to f4. So let's go with the gambit style and play the pawn to f4. If he accepts the gambit and captures on the f4 square, then we have this sneaky little move pawn to e5, attacking the knight. Funnily enough, the knight has no good squares to go to. Cannot go to d5 or e4 as your knight is controlling those squares. And he cannot go to any of these squares because of the queen. So knight will have to go back. The time knight goes back, now you can play, there's this threat is alive, right? The queen can come to h4. Defend this by playing your knight to f3. And now when he is trying to get your knight off by playing the pawn to d6, then you can go with strength in the center. You can go with the pawn to d4. If he captured, we don't need to recapture immediately. In our last video, we have seen since the queen will get exchanged and we don't want to do that, we have seen about queen e2. But today there's a little trap that you can do. I'm going to show you how about playing the bishop to b5 and giving a check. He will definitely block it with the pawn, and once he does that, now you come back on the c4 square with your bishop. Don't worry about losing this pawn. Here you are 3 pawns down, but we don't care. Also, our knight is in danger. But since you are playing in the gambit style, you can sacrifice the knight as well and just capture on the f4 square your bishop. If he gets greedy and captures your knight, well, he's gone then, because bishop f7 gives a check. If he captures the bishop, then the queen is gone. Do that, he comes with his king on the e7 square, then don't go bishop g5 because he can anytime block it with the knight. That is not winning. Instead, can you find the winning move here? The winning continuation is to play the queen to e2 and give a check. If the king goes anywhere on the e file, so queen e6 is a checkmate on spot, and if he blocks it with the bishop, still queen e6 will be a checkmate. So he cannot block or move the king. Then what can he do? Going on the f6 will expose the king further, so he can capture the bishop. The best way is to capture the bishop. He does that, you can go with your knight to e5 and attack the king. The king has no option to go on the e file because then it will be a discovery and he will be losing the queen. So it's better to go on the f5. Let's say the king goes to f6. Now here you can give a check, play the bishop to g5, sacrificing the bishop. Let's say the king captures it on the g5 square, and then there's a beautiful family folk knight to f7, attacking the queen, the king as well as the rook. You are definitely going to win the queen. Not only that, in few moves you will be able to give a checkmate as well. This is a completely winning position for white. Okay, so this was trick number 1. Now let's say what if he is, after capturing, he is trying to act a little over smart. After you play a pawn to e5, he's not getting the knight back on the g8 square. Instead, he is pinning your pawn by playing his queen to e7. But does that affect us? No, we can also unpin it by playing our queen to e2. Now the threat is renewed. He cannot do anything, so he will have to go with his knight back on the g8 square. And now queen h4 is a threat, so you go with the knight to f3. All the pieces in the black's camp are cramped, right? They cannot move, and the main problem is the pawn on e5. If he wants to get rid of the pawn on e5, he'll have to push his pawn to d6. And once he does that, he can also play his knight to c6. We'll see both the moves in a while. Let's start with the d6 move. He plays pawn d6, you play the knight to d5, attacking the queen. Now queen cannot go to e6 because knight c7 will be a fork. So he'll have to go on the d7 square or d8. Doesn't matter where the queen goes because still you are going to go knight c7 and give a fork. Check and win the rook. If the queen captures the knight on the c7 square, then again the queen is gone because it's a discovery, attacking the queen, and that's a check. So he loses the queen. Okay. Coming back to the move, what if he's not playing his pawn to d6, instead he is playing his knight to c6. After knight c6, you can add some more defenders to the e5 pawn and you can play a pawn to d4. Whenever he plays his pawn to d6, you are ready to jump in with your knight on the d5 square and just play your knight to d5, attack the queen. The queen goes to d7, knight c7 and wins the queen one more time in the same fashion. Here you are also ready, after pawn d4, you are also ready to capture on the f4 square and strengthen the center one more time. Okay, so this was all when he accepts the gambit. Now let's see what if he's not accepting the gambit. Instead, he's defending his pawn on e5 by either pushing the pawn to d6 or knight to c6. In our last video, we have discussed both of these moves in detail. If in case you have missed, then the link is in the description box. Okay, let's see what is the correct continuation for black. The correct continuation for black is to play pawn to d5. If your opponent has not studied Vienna, he'll never be able to find the pawn to d5 move. Pawn d5 comes only after you know the theory. Here, you can first capture on the e5 square and he's going to capture your pawn on e4 with the knight because the pawn defends it. Now we can play our queen to f3. The sneaky little moves gives you an advantage because now the knight cannot go back. Let's say he exchanged the knight and you are doing perfectly fine here as white. Okay, so now coming down to the move, what if he's not playing his knight to f6? Instead, he's playing his knight to c6. So even after knight c6, you can go pawn f4, but that is a little risky as I have suggested you in the last video as well. This time, I'm going to show you a complete variation of what to do after bishop c4. So let's say you play a bishop to c4 and your opponent will definitely copy you and will play the bishop to c5 because you have developed one of the knight, the other bishop needs to develop. He plays his bishop to c5 and then you can play this move queen to g4. Now look at this little move queen g4. Gives an attack to this pawn. Right? If he defends it in the most common way like playing the queen to f6, defending the pawn on the g7 square, also giving you a threat on f2, we actually don't worry about it. What we can do is jump in with the knight on the d5 square and attack the queen. If he gives you a check, you can just move. The one is not going to be a checkmate because bishop defends it. Also now look at black's pieces. The knight is ready to jump in on the c7 square, give a fork and win this rook. Also, the queen can capture the pawn on the g7 square and win the other rook. So, actually both the rooks are in danger. If he tries to defend it by pushing his pawn to d6, then you can first capture on g7 square, attack the rook. If he plays his bishop to e6, you don't immediately need to capture the rook. You can instead first give an attack to the queen, play your knight to h3. He captures your knight. Now you give an attack to the queen again, play your rook to f1. Now why have we done this? Because we want to give a checkmate. So after few follow-up moves, it is going to be a checkmate. You follow the king till death and that will be a checkmate. Okay, let's see what if he's not doing a random move like pawn to d6. Instead, he's doing a move like pawn g6. Still, that doesn't matter because you are going to give an attack to the queen, play your knight to h3, and when the queen goes to d4 square, now you box it up. The queen is trapped. He cannot go anywhere. Next is coming pawn c3 and you can gobble up the king. Okay. So pawn g6 is also not great. King f8 results in the same position. What if he plays his knight to f6? Trying to give an attack to your queen, and when the queen captures on the g7 square, he can attack your queen by playing his rook to g8. But that is also lost to knight f6 check, and then you can win the rook as well. So overall, this position results completely in favor of white and you have an attack. Also, you will be materially advantageous there. So this was when we have seen when he mimics you and plays his bishop to c5. Coming back to the normal looking move, what if he plays his knight to f6? As we are trained to move our knights before the bishop. So what if he plays his knight to f6? Here after knight f6, there's actually a threat. If you play a pawn to f4, he's gonna capture on the e4 square. And then if you play pawn f4, he's gonna capture on the e4 square. When you capture back the knight, the pawn comes to d5 square and this position will be advantageous. We don't want that to happen. So what can you do? Instead of playing your pawn to f4, you first strengthen the center. You play a pawn to d3. Now when he plays his bishop to c5, now you are ready to jump in with the pawn to f4 or anything else. If he captures it, then you can anytime recapture the pawn. And again, as white, the position is comfortable. In fact, you have a slight initiative there and you're going to win the game easily. So these were all the tricks in the Vienna game and the Vienna Gambit. Vienna Gambit accepted and declined variations. I hope you will find this helpful in your games, the tricks, traps and the strategies that we have discussed today. If you like our video, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel and share with your friends. Thank you.